the morning of November the 1st, 1755, thousands of people filled the churches of Lisbon. Candles burned, prayers echoed through the city, and nobody had any idea that within the next hour, their world would cease to exist, not because of war, not because of disease, but because nature itself was about to unleash one of the deadliest disasters in human history. And for those who lived through it, it felt like Judgment Day. At exactly 9:40 in the morning, the ground began to move. At first, many thought they were imagining it, but then the floor beneath them rolled like waves. Walls cracked, church towers swayed, and in seconds, entire buildings began collapsing onto the people inside. Screams replaced prayers. Dust filled the air. And all across Lisbon, people ran into the streets believing the end of the world had arrived. But the earthquake was only the beginning, because what came next would kill thousands more. For the people of Lisbon, November the 1st, 1755, began like any other holy day. It was All Saints' Day, one of the most important religious celebrations of the year. By sunrise, thousands of families had already gathered inside churches across the city. Candles flickered in front of statues of saints. Priests recited prayers, and the streets outside were filled with merchants, sailors, and ordinary people beginning their day. No one imagined that within the next hour, much of the city would simply disappear. Lisbon was one of the richest cities in Europe, a center of trade, a symbol of Portugal's empire. Ships arrived daily from Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Gold, spices, and silk flowed into its ports. To many, Lisbon seemed untouchable. But just before 9:40 in the morning, something strange happened. Birds suddenly scattered. Dogs began barking. And then, without warning, the earth exploded beneath the city. People were thrown to the ground. Church bells rang violently by themselves. Massive stone columns cracked apart. And within seconds, entire churches collapsed onto the worshippers inside. Thousands who had gathered to pray never made it out alive. One survivor later described the floor beneath him as moving like the sea itself. Another wrote that buildings rose and fell, as if the city had become a ship trapped in a storm. Screams echoed through the streets. Dust covered the sky, and terrified survivors rushed outside, believing that open ground would save them. They had no idea that they were running towards something far worse. By now, much of Lisbon had become a graveyard of stone and dust. Terrified survivors poured into the open spaces surrounding the harbour. The waterfront seemed safe. There were no collapsing buildings, no falling walls, no clouds of debris. For the first time since the nightmare began, many believed they had escaped. And then, something strange caught their attention. The water was disappearing, slowly at first, then rapidly. The mighty Tagus River began pulling away from the shore. Ships tilted sideways. Boats settled into the mud. And where water had once covered everything, the bottom of the harbour appeared. People stared in disbelief. Curiosity replaced fear. Some rushed forward. Others stood frozen. Beneath them, strange objects emerged from the mud. Broken cargo, pieces of shipwrecks, fish flopping helplessly in the open air. To many, it made no sense. Some called it a miracle. Others simply stood and watched. But far beyond the horizon, something terrible was approaching. Something no one in Lisbon had ever seen. At first, it appeared as a dark line in the distance. Then people noticed it growing larger and larger, until panic spread through the crowd. People pointed toward the sea. Others began screaming. Mothers grabbed their children. Men abandoned everything they carried. And then, the ocean attacked. A massive wall of water crashed into the harbor. Ships were lifted into the streets. Buildings vanished beneath the waves. Entire families disappeared in seconds. Those who had escaped the earthquake were now swallowed by the sea. One witness later wrote that bodies, horses, furniture, and ships were all carried together through the city. And when the water finally began to retreat, the survivors looked back toward Lisbon, only to discover that a new nightmare had already begun. But the ocean had only delivered the second blow. The third would turn Lisbon into hell itself. Across the ruined city, hundreds of candles still burned inside churches. Oil lamps had been thrown to the ground. Cooking fires had been left unattended. And with strong winds sweeping through the rubble, small flames began to spread. Then they merged. And before long, entire districts of Lisbon were burning. The survivors who had escaped the earthquake and somehow survived the tsunami now found themselves trapped once again. Walls of fire blocked the streets. Smoke swallowed the sky. And panic returned. Some desperately jumped into wells. Others hid inside cellars. Many suffocated. Many burned alive. One witness later described the city as a giant furnace. Another wrote that night itself had disappeared. The sky glowed red, and ash fell like snow. For 5 days, the fires continued. 5 days. Churches burned, markets burned, palaces burned, homes burned. Almost everything the survivors had once known was gone. And among the ruins, thousands wandered in shock. Parents searched for children. Children searched for parents. Families searched for loved ones they would never see again. Bodies lay everywhere. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of death. And slowly, another kind of fear began spreading. Not fear of another earthquake, not fear of another wave, but something far worse. Many people became convinced that this wasn't simply a disaster. This was punishment. God Himself had turned against them. Judgment Day had arrived. And soon, the terrifying news from Lisbon would spread across Europe. And with it, a question that nobody could answer. Why would God allow this to happen? As news of the disaster spread across Europe, people struggled to understand what had happened. Entire churches had collapsed. Thousands had died while praying. And many asked the same terrifying question. How could God allow this? In Lisbon, some believed they already knew the answer. This wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't bad luck. It was punishment. Judgment Day had arrived. Rumors spread quickly. Many claimed the end of the world was near. Others believed God had abandoned mankind entirely. Fear spread faster than the flames themselves. But perhaps the greatest shock came from one terrible detail. November 1st was All Saints' Day, one of the holiest days of the year. Thousands had gathered inside churches seeking salvation. And yet, the churches themselves had become tombs. Meanwhile, many taverns and brothels had survived. To some, it made no sense. To others, it was proof that God worked in ways humans could never understand. Across Europe, priests preached, philosophers argued, and ordinary people asked questions that had no answers. One of those people was the French philosopher Voltaire. The disaster haunted him. How could innocent people die so horribly? Why would children suffer? Why would God allow such destruction? Questions like these would spread far beyond Portugal, because for many, the Lisbon earthquake had shattered something far greater than buildings. It had shattered certainty itself. For centuries, people had believed the world followed a divine order. But after Lisbon, many began searching for answers somewhere else. Not in miracles, not in prophecy, but in reason and science. Without realizing it, the survivors of Lisbon had witnessed something far larger than a disaster. They had witnessed the beginning of a new way of thinking, and the consequences of that one terrible hour would change Europe forever. In the days that followed, the survivors of Lisbon faced an impossible task. Their city was gone. Tens of thousands were dead. And yet, life had to continue. As bodies were cleared from the streets and the fires finally died out, Portugal's Prime Minister, the Marquis of Pombal, took control. His instructions were simple. Now, we bury the dead and feed the living. It was a response that helped prevent even greater chaos. But while Lisbon slowly began rebuilding, something far bigger was happening. Scientists began collecting reports. Questions were asked. How long did the shaking last? Which areas suffered the most? How high were the waves? Without knowing it, people had begun studying earthquakes in ways never seen before. Some historians even consider the Lisbon disaster the birth of modern seismology. But perhaps the greatest change happened inside people's minds. For centuries, disasters had been explained through faith, through divine punishment, through prophecy. But after Lisbon, many people wanted different answers. Not superstition, not fear, but evidence, reason, science. The Age of Enlightenment had already begun, but the disaster of 1755 forced Europe to confront difficult questions. Questions about faith, questions about suffering, questions about humanity itself. And nearly 3 centuries later, those questions still remain. Today, millions of people walk the streets of Lisbon without realizing what happened beneath their feet. The churches have been rebuilt. The markets are full. Life has returned. But hidden beneath the modern city lies the memory of one terrible hour. An hour that brought earthquakes. An hour that brought the sea. An hour that brought fire. And an hour that changed Europe forever. Because sometimes history isn't shaped over centuries. Sometimes history changes in a single morning.